that, I'm going to just go ahead and get us started today. So, hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us at Secular AZ. We are a nonprofit organization focused on protecting the Constitution and the separation of church and state for over a decade. We have incredible programming, including our Friday updates from all kinds of amazing speakers, including historians, authors, elected officials, journalists, etc. Next Friday, I believe we're going to be hearing from, is it Jess Lark next Friday? Oh no, John Dacey. Okay, got it. This one is going to be really interesting, as well as the one today. John Dacey is going to be joining us to talk about abolishing private prisons. So we'll be having conversations about all kinds of different things, what it's like for an inmate in Arizona prisons, the juvenile justice system, etc. This weekend we'll be at the Tucson Festival of Books. I just heard on the radio today how many people are drawn into this and how great an event it is. So hopefully I'll be able to make it down there Sunday. Otherwise, I'll be at the Melrose Street Fair on Saturday, which is also a great time. If you're interested in volunteering or just showing up, come on by. We have some great banned books that we'll be taking donations for in Tucson. So we just got some new banned book t-shirts as well. And we look forward to seeing y'all. But today I'm really excited because we are joined today by Jared Keenan. He is the legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Arizona, where he oversees the ACLU of Arizona's litigation docket and manages a team of 4 staff attorneys focusing on criminal justice reform, education equity, LGBTQ plus equality, and immigrants' rights, in addition to other core civil rights and civil liberties issues in both state and federal court. After graduating from Boston University School of Law, Jared worked as a public defender in Boston, Massachusetts, and in Mojave and Yavapai counties in Arizona before joining the ACLU of Arizona. As a public defender, Jared represented individuals charged with serious felony offenses, including capital murder. He also represented criminal defendants on appeal and through special actions, arguing several times before the Arizona Court of Appeals and the Arizona Supreme Court. As legal director of the ACLU of Arizona, he continues to work on criminal law reform in the state through advocacy and litigation, focusing on prisoners' rights, prosecutor transparency and accountability, and reform to Arizona's criminal code and rules. He's also past president of Arizona Attorneys for Criminal Justice. Whew, that's a lengthy resume. Did I miss anything?
No, that was more than enough.
All right, well, I am just going to go ahead and hand it over to you. And for everybody else, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Take it away.
Thank you so much. First off, thank you for having me. I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak. I'm going to try to share my screen if I can. Let's see here. Where is my... Okay, hold on. It would help if I opened up the thing I needed. So I hope this is, I have some photos and I want to give a sort of warning up front. Some of the photos are kind of disturbing as they relate to some prison conditions. And specifically medical neglect in our prisons. And so I just want to, I'll give another warning before I show any of those photos, but I think they're important to see when we're discussing some of the issues related to criminal legal reform in Arizona. Let me try this again, share screen, and there it is. Okay. And let me put this on slideshow. There we go. Okay. You don't need that. Okay. So anyway, before I get there to the pictures, let me just say that I think it's wonderful that Secular Arizona, the Secular Coalition, is putting on these discussions about criminal legal reform. I will try my best to only refer to it as criminal legal reform and the criminal legal system, as opposed to what is, I guess, more common at this point, the criminal justice system. And that's because there is very little, if any, justice that the system provides. I will talk a bit about the sort of issues related to victims and victims' rights and stuff like that, and why the system actually is more harmful to victims than it is helpful. But I certainly don't like to refer to it as a criminal justice system or criminal justice reform for the reason that I just said, which is that I think that the outcomes of the system are, by and large, if not entirely, bad. And I think it is wonderful that atheists, agnostics, skeptics, free thinkers, however folks identify, are thinking about this issue and getting involved in this space. I think folks like us, can't rely on or don't rely on the way things have always been done. We don't have blind faith in doing things a certain way, and so we need evidence to as the basis for our beliefs, our views about society, views about the interactions of people, the way we solve issues, and we need that sort of evidence when discussing important public policy issues like criminal legal reform or the criminal legal system. And so folks involved in this coalition are precisely the types of people who should be thinking about these issues, because a lot of what folks think about the criminal legal system and how we deal with crime sort of gets it wrong, and it's not only ineffective, it is in many cases counterproductive. And so I'll start off by saying, so I think the need for criminal legal reform around the country is enormous. And the need for it in Arizona is certainly, we are among the top states that need significant criminal legal reform. We are a leader in mass incarceration, and we waste billions of dollars every year on warehousing people in cages to solve problems that really the root of which is not addressed by incarceration and sort of harsh penalties. Arizona is I think can only be described as a prison first state. It is the first solution we use in almost every situation. The criminal code is designed with that in mind. It is, while people do get probation in many instances, right? That is because the system, even a system as awful as our criminal legal system, right, gets that putting even more people in prison is not the way to go. And so, but if you were to read sort of the criminal code, the only takeaway would be that the first step is to send people to prison. There are very few instances where probation is required, and that is only with a couple first-time personal drug offenses, and that's only because voters in Arizona demanded that the legislature that we added that to our statutes. And so when we think about the issues that we're going to discuss today, keep in mind, that Arizona has a long way to go. If I was giving this talk maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe even 1 year ago, I think I would have been much more optimistic about the chances of robust criminal legal reform occurring in Arizona. I back then, a few years ago, I think I was the most optimistic I had ever been about the chances of robust criminal legal reform happening in the state. It was a very, very hot topic. Lots of people were talking about it across the political spectrum. There were a number of liberal, progressive organizations talking about it. There were a number of conservative, libertarian organizations talking about it. There were a number of faith groups talking about it, secular groups talking about it. And it seemed like the momentum was starting to shift away from what had previously been essentially, get tough on crime rhetoric, and things seem to be changing. It turned out that my optimism was probably a bit too great at that time. It turns out that the types of, I think, reform that are needed in states like Arizona and throughout the country is just much more difficult to achieve than maybe I'd first than I was thinking maybe two or 3 years ago. A lot of the groups, particularly conservative groups, have moved on from this issue and onto other things. And I'll show you this first clip or chart here. This is basically the run up to the 2020 midterm elections. All of the major sort of media outlets that millions and millions of Americans rely on for news or propaganda in some sense for some of these sort of incredibly ramped up their discussions of crime leading into that election. And so it wasn't just Fox News, or they were clearly the sort of worst offender, but CNN and MSNBC also played this game as well, where they the number of the amount of time they spent talking about crime rose significantly. And I'll say, the interesting thing, a lot of people, the media can sort of lead these conversations for good or bad. And I'll mention, there are a number of amazing outlets to get actual decent reporting on criminal legal issues. These issues are very complicated, and so you need to go to places like the Marshall Project, the Appeal, individual reporters like Radley Balco, who used to work for the Washington Post and now works independently. He has a Substack media account or service. Jimmy Jenkins, a local reporter who I know spoke to your group recently, is an amazing reporter, that does great work on these issues and in-depth reporting on these issues. But for the most part, right, the sort of mainstream media has really dropped the ball. As you can see here, now this is probably not surprising, right? If you look at Fox News's mention of violent crime, right, it immediately drops off as soon as the midterm election was over, right? They obviously thought that discussing violent crime a lot was going to help Republicans, and so as soon as the election was over, they just dropped down and started talking about other stuff, which is a problem because our crime rate, while it has in some places and in some related to some crimes, have gone up over the last couple of years, likely tied to issues surrounding the pandemic. Although it's very difficult to sort of get a pinpoint explanation of why crime rises and falls. Crime is at like very low rates, right? Because if you look at sort of trends throughout like decades as opposed to like the last 2 decades, we are at we're much lower. Violent crime and stuff like that is much lower than it was in the like say late 90s. Let's see. The other journalist I mentioned to answer Beth's question is Radley is his first name, Radley, Balco, Balko. He does a lot of reporting on policing issues, but he also does some sort of more broad stuff related to criminal justice. Sorry, see, even I do it. Criminal legal issues generally. Okay, and so. And so part of the reason why, I'm a little less optimistic is not only because the sort of narrative has sort of the focus on the need for reform has shifted, but there are now a lot of particularly, I think Democrats are beginning to be a little more shy about speaking out for robust reform, and Republicans are sort of going the other way and talking about the need for more harsher penalties. A lot of this stuff is completely, I would say, here we go, based on misinformation. This is a recent report. Fentanyl is now sort of something that is talked about a lot. You can go online and see lots of videos of police officers who claim to be having an overdose by coming into like contact with fentanyl, it just doesn't happen. I mean, fentanyl isn't a, well, I mean, it's a drug that has legitimate applications, and it is administered. It was developed for cancer patients to deal with the pain of that cancer patients were dealing with, and there are legitimate reasons to use fentanyl, but the risk associated with it, right? You start seeing calls for greater and greater and harsher penalties, none of which are going to actually solve the problems caused by fentanyl, right? If you're concerned about overdoses, you should be concerned about the war on drugs, not on increasing penalties for people who transfer, distribute, or even sell fentanyl or any other drug, right? One thing that I think a lot of people just don't really think about is the problems with fentanyl that we're seeing with increased overdose deaths and stuff like this are not happening despite the war on drugs. They are happening precisely because of the war on drugs. When you create a black market, right, you create situations where less than above board actors are going to exploit these situations, right? And so you have no way of regulating the drugs that people are selling on the streets, illicit drugs on the streets, and fentanyl is very, very cheap. And so basic economics will tell you that that is why we have this problem. It's the creation of a black market and sort of market incentives, not that we're not harsh enough on drug crimes generally. There was, I'm going to skip ahead a few and come back, sorry. Let me see here. This gets to the point. I think most of you, I can't hear what you're saying, but most of you probably recognize who this person is. If you don't recognize the photo, you probably know the name. That's Al Capone. He was known for not only getting rich as a mafia figure during Prohibition, but he was also known for extreme violence in sort of the work that he did. Here's another person you may recognize. That's El Chapo, another drug dealer, also known for violence related to the drug trade. And if you don't recognize him, a little bit older figure, sort of Pablo Escobar, right? Also known as a drug trafficker, international drug trafficker, and also tied to a lot of violence. So here's my next question. But few of you, if any of you, probably recognize this person. That's Brendan Whitworth. Or you probably don't recognize this person. This is Joaquin Duato. Mr. Duato is the CEO of Johnson & Johnson. That company has two subsidiary companies that produce pharmaceutical fentanyl. Mr. Whitworth, on the guy with the not wearing a tie, he is the CEO of AB InBev, which is the company that produces Anheuser-Busch and a number of other alcoholic beverages. What's something that these two people are generally unknown to most people. I didn't know what they looked like until I Googled them and found photos of them. But one thing they're not known for, right, is violence, right? The CEO of Anheuser-Busch isn't executing the CEO and others that work for Coors, right? Miller Coors or whatever. The CEO of Joaquin Duato, the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, right, isn't having turf wars, bloody battles with the CEO of other drug manufacturers, right? And yet these people create things that for, at least for alcohol, was illegal in this country, and for fentanyl, depending on where it's coming from, is currently illegal. And so I think the interesting thing, right, is just to show that, like, when you think you're going to solve a problem, you often create more problems than you actually solve. And I think that is, I hope, right, one of the main takeaways you take away from when you start thinking about the criminal legal system, which is that these things just they don't work, and in many ways, like I said, they're counterproductive. Let me go back a couple, sorry. And feel free to put, since I can't hear you, questions in the chat, and I'll try to check them periodically. Okay, so other things about the criminal legal system, right? They talk about, right, the problem is crime, right? And obviously no one wants to be a victim of a crime. But, right, when you look at studies, we find out that, again, not only is the way we deal with these social ills and crime generally is, again, not only ineffective, but counterproductive, right? So this study is a meta-analysis, right? So basically that means a study of studies. And what that study looked at was a bunch of studies that looked at like the outcomes the outcomes of mass imprisonment, mass incarceration. And if you see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you look at right here in the middle here, right? When they conducted this meta study of current analysis related to outcomes of incarceration, right? They found that incarcerating people has little or no effect to reoffending, or slightly increases the chances that people will commit more crimes in the future, right? And so not only is locking up massive amounts of people, setting aside all the racial disparities in who is locked up, right? And certainly the economic and class sort of problems with who is locked up, right? Meaning poor people are and rich people are not. We don't get anything from this, right? Not only do we not get something from this, but more people are victimized by crime because we lock up so many people. Let me come back through some of these questions. Question for you. Why are Dems shy about talking about crime? I don't know. I'm not a elected Democrat or elected anything, but I think it's because they think they're going to lose that debate, right? And they're going to lose voters and votes if they sort of dive in. The soft on crime thing has worked very well for Republicans for a long time. And then as soon as Democrats adopted it, Joe Biden being one in his earlier years, Bill Clinton, right? They adopted a very tough on crime stance, and it seems to not have. They've done quite well, and so I think that's part of it. Yes. So John asked a question about compensation provided to innocent prisoners. So some states have statutes that compensate those that we've wrongfully convicted and sent to prison. Arizona is not one of them. So we currently do not have any kind of system to compensate those who are wrongly convicted. Let's see. Here's another study, right? So the last study sort of talked about the negative impacts that we all face because of mass incarceration. This one looked at the impacts to those who chronically engage in criminal activity, as it said. And even there's few, if any, beneficial effects, right? Obviously, when an individual person is in a facility, they can't commit more crimes outside of that facility, but the disruptive effects are the things that lead to additional crime after the fact. And one thing to keep in mind is, and we'll get to this in a bit later, right? Throwing people into prisons has a ton of negative effects. Sexual assaults are a serious problem in our prisons, as well as other violent crimes. And so we are creating the conditions to allow additional crimes to be perpetrated against people who we've locked away for perpetrating crimes, right? Very few people, and the other thing, the narrative about like victim versus perpetrator is makes no sense in reality, right? Almost everyone that is in prison or has been to prison has been a victim of some kind of crime, likely a violent crime in their life at some point. Many people who are considered victims of crime and are touted as this is why we need to do X, Y, and Z, right, have also perpetrated many crimes in their life, and either got away with it or whatever. And so let me jump forward a little bit. We went through this. Okay. I don't know if we need to talk about this right now. Let me jump out of here real quick. So let's see. When we, I will show you this though. And when we talk about victims right here, this is a letter, quite a touching letter, right? This letter was written by a young child to his father, who is serving time in jail or prison, right? This child is a victim of the system, right? And like, setting aside, obviously, right, setting aside whatever the father did to or may have done, because we do convict a lot of innocent people in this country, to find himself in jail, right? His child didn't commit that crime, right? And yet his child has a parent, a father who he clearly loves, that, or she, I'm not sure who is the child or they, but they have a father who they clearly love, that they miss, that they need in their lives, that we have taken away from them because, locking people in cages is really the only solution we're willing to dump money into. Arizona spends over $1 billion every year locking people in our state prisons. We get very little benefit. Like I said, we get actually a negative outcomes from that. But we are removing people from society in that way. Right. That's what it does, right? It removes people, even people that have done bad things, right? From their family, from their loved one, from their support system, and from people who need them, like not only young children, but when we lock up breadwinners, right, the rest of the family and community feel the repercussions of that. One thing, whoops, so I'm going to get to the sort of some of the troubling slides in a moment, now that we're talking about the prison system, because when you talk about some of those studies talked about the negative externalities of locking up massive amounts of people, right? So it actually either has no effect on crime rates, or if anything, increases them, right? So we're not getting anything out of it that we want to. But when you throw people in prisons, as I mentioned, right, these places are not safe. Certainly, right? They're not. They're awful places, and in Arizona, they are particularly awful. And for decades, our elected officials turned a blind eye, or ignored, or just simply did not care about how awful the conditions in our prisons were. We have a case that we just won in federal court that found that the Arizona state prison system systematically violates the constitutional rights of the people that are inside. This is, as you can see, right, 14%, right? This is sort of they were supposed to hit these performance measures, right? The PM 37 is a performance measure that the prison was supposed to. They agreed to this. This was initially in a stipulated settlement agreement that we made with the Department of Corrections, which was then scrapped eventually by the federal judge because she was just so appalled by how much non-compliance the prison was in. And so, right, and like grossly non-compliant, right? 14%. That's what they were hitting on this performance measure. This performance measure, 10%, right? December of 2018, they were down to 0% on that performance measure. I mean, this is not even, I mean, you almost have to try to be that bad. And so now I'm going to get into, and so these are sort of like the numbers, but what does this mean to individual, to human suffering, to individual people who are serving time in prison? It means very, very bad things. This individual on the left died because of untreated cancer. The photo on the other side that says voices, that word is written in blood. This person was had severe mental health issues and was supposed to be on watch, on consistent watch, because of the likelihood that he would attempt to commit suicide. Despite being on 24-hour watch, he was able to commit suicide and wrote a note in his own blood after slitting his throat, or some other injuries before he did that. And you know, the prison, while this man, by the way, who wrote this voices note, was dying, was bleeding out and dying, guards watched him do that and called and did not call for any medical help.
There's one quick question. There's
Yes.
one quick question here. She says, this is from Jess, that case was 1 year ago and brought again because no changes were made. What are we doing this time to ensure they actually fix those issues?
Yes. So this case was brought years ago. So it was brought in, yeah, and before we went to trial, the department agreed to a settlement, which included a bunch of these performance measures, 2 of which I showed you. They then, you know, failed to comply. The agreement was scrapped, and we went to trial in 2019, I believe. The pandemic years are all running together. So I apologize. We then won at trial, and we are now working on an order from the court that will order the Department of Corrections to do what it needs to do to comply with the court's finding that it was grossly non-compliant and provided unconstitutional medical care. So that the remedial order is not yet in effect. And so, but it will be, and that will hopefully force change in the department. I will say that I think the fact that we have a governor who is taking this situation seriously and seems to understand that the conditions in our prison system are just inhumane, is going to do more than potentially what this court orders, because there previously was essentially a court order in place, and the Department of Corrections thumbed its nose at it and did not comply with it for years and years and years, causing untold suffering, unnecessary suffering. This gentleman in the wheelchair, he had I wouldn't say simple, but he had a broken leg. It was untreated, and now he cannot use that leg anymore. This person on the right had an injury that he received while on a work crew. They didn't treat it. They just sort of didn't treat it properly or timely, and now he lost the use of that arm and hand. This gentleman sent this notice of impending death to the court, and shortly thereafter he died of untreated cancer, melanoma. The cancer was so bad and so untreated that it ate through his skin into his skull and into his brain, killing him. This gentleman sent this notice, "I'm being killed," because of lack of medical care that he was receiving. He was afraid that he was going to die. He filed this, and before it even made it onto the court's docket, he died. And that is because the criminal legal system, does not view a lot of these individuals as people deserving of respect and dignity, and so this is the type of stuff that happens when you allow systems to perpetuate sort of those types of beliefs. So these are like dirty, disgusting conditions in some of our jails. By the way, these photos were taken by our team when we went into the prison to speak with our clients, who are the folks in the prison, so they have advanced warning. They had like 6 weeks advanced warning before we came on this trip, and yet they couldn't even be bothered to clean up those shower stalls. This is a note that we saw while touring the prison. Diets eat last. What that means is, if you are on a special diet, a diabetic diet, some other sort of medical a diet necessary for some sort of medical need, right? You get served your food last, not first, which is completely backwards and doesn't make any sense unless, cruelty is the purpose. And in many ways, it most certainly is. I want to go back as far as the dehumanization aspects. The dehumanization aspects of our criminal legal system occur from the start to the end, right? The stuff in the prison, that's sort of the end. After that, there's sort of no support for folks that get out of prison. But even the beginning of the process, right? This is a sort of little infographic that we designed related to a lawsuit that we have that's currently on appeal because our case got dismissed because it's so hard to convince the courts that for threatening people with substantially harsher penalties if they don't accept a first plea offer, and they which requires them to give up a bunch of rights, that coercing them in that way is totally fine under our Constitution, right? That's essentially what the district court ruled. That is currently on appeal. But when we talk about dehumanization, the next slide is something that the Maricopa County Attorney's Office created because of our litigation, right? And they wanted to show us an updated, right? So the last one said substantially harsher, right? They wanted to say, oh no, we fixed this policy. Now it's just the presumption is that it will be harsher, right? It's not substantially harsher; it's the presumption will be harsher. We don't see much difference in those two things. But that's not even the point here. The point I'm trying to show you is look at the name that they created for a hypothetical defendant, right? Someone charged with a crime. Prosecutors have a duty to seek justice and not just convictions. And yet when they know that this is going to come to us, this is an exhibit in the court, in the federal court in this case, right? When they're defending against their policy of threatening people with presumptively harsher or substantially harsher penalties, right? For exercising constitutional rights. They chose to use Scar Beelzebub bad guy as their hypothetical criminal defendant, literally calling that person the devil, right? I don't have a slide of this, but in a public records request from a couple of years ago from Maricopa County Attorney's Office, we got some training materials that referred to, that had to do with like people charged with crimes who have mental health issues. And the titles of these trainings was, "Look at me, I'm crazy." There was another one that said, basically said like, how normal do I have to act to get out of here? Suggesting that everyone who has mental health issues is just faking it to get out of, I don't know, the prosecution or something. And so like, these are the problems that we see, right? From start to finish, the criminal legal system dehumanizes folks. And I think, it certainly makes it sort of easier for the folks in the system to deal with the sort of ramifications of what they're doing when they can dehumanize the folks that they're prosecuting and sending to prison and whatnot. But it's troubling nonetheless. Let me see here. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and let's see here. And I think I saw some questions. Maybe I didn't. I thought I saw something pop up.
Well, there was some comments, and Kara says that she's been through exactly that. And then I just made the comment that evangelicals believe that mental health means demonic possession. So this tracks.
Yes. And so again, right, this gets back to why it's so important for folks like organizations and folks involved in these organizations like yours to think about these issues, because again, these are very tricky issues, and it requires people who are willing to grapple with difficult questions and look at data to see sort of what the best policies are moving forward. Currently in Arizona, there are, I would say, the successes that criminal justice reformers have had in Arizona have been marginal, and that's not to take away from those victories. They were hard fought and great victories in some senses, but it's very difficult to. We're not, put it this way, it took us decades and decades to get where we are, and we're not going to undo sort of the damage and fix the criminal legal system overnight. It is going to take concerted efforts over the long haul. I will sort of one specific thing I'll mention, because I did look back at some of your recordings of previous folks that spoke to you. And one piece of purportedly criminal justice reform legislation that is being pushed this year that I would like to suggest, that was suggested that you support, and I would suggest that you not support it, is a bail reform proposal. I believe there was Amelia Kramer spoke to you about a bail reform proposal. I am happy to discuss the sort of the specifics about why I think that is a bad proposal. I know it's touted as bail reform and a criminal justice reform measure, but if you read the actual language of what is being proposed, it, in my view, will make it much more likely that more people will be held with cash bail than the current system. I also have some very strong disagreements with the way, with the messaging that has been tied to it. You know, when the messaging is talking about dangerous people that must be kept in jail pre-trial despite the fact that they are presumed innocent, versus people who commit low-level misdemeanors who shouldn't be in jail pre-trial, I think you've already bought into the tough on crime sort of storyline. While and I'll just be frank, yes, there are one, it's very difficult to be able to predict whether someone's going to commit a violent crime while they're on release, right? And so when something bad happens, there may not be a solution. Sometimes there's just simply not a way to prevent this from happening. I think there are better ways of doing it, and that gets to spending money, not billions of dollars on our prison system, but money on job training and housing assistance and stuff like this, things that help people not think about committing crimes to begin with. You know, I'll say the current state of the law allows people who pose a demonstrable threat to public safety to be held without bail. And the changes in that piece of legislation is just going to make it, in my view, much easier to hold people, many more people in jail pre-trial on cash bail. And so, you know, I hope it's okay to disagree with previous guests here, but that is my one concern. And then the other issue that I think is you're going to hear more about because of a decision that came out yesterday from the Arizona Supreme Court is the death penalty. There is absolutely no sort of empirical data to suggest that the death penalty works for anything other than just, you know, straight retribution. And it is imposed in a racist way. It is imposed in a classist way. In Arizona, as in around the country, here's it. In Arizona, you are more likely to get the death penalty, and for prosecutors to seek the death penalty, and if you actually get the death penalty, if you murder a white woman. If you murder a Black woman or a Black man, you're very unlikely to get the death penalty. The race of the perpetrator also plays a role, not as much as the race of the victim, but it does play a role, right? And so the combination, the worst combination, the combination that's, or perhaps I should say, the combination that's most likely to get someone the death penalty is if a Black man murders a white woman, right? That is, you know, the underlying crime is the same, right? First degree premeditated murder is the only crime that can get you the death penalty in this country. That wasn't always the case, but that is the case now. And the fact that the race of both the victim and the perpetrator play an outsized role in the likelihood of getting a death sentence is, in my view, reason alone to scrap it. And I applaud the governor and the attorney general who are going to conduct a investigation into the way that we conduct capital punishment in Arizona, and with, you know, I suppose the view to reform it, but but I think that any actual investigation into the death penalty system in any state is going to show that it cannot be imposed in a fair way. And so we have some time. I guess I'll stop there. And maybe
there is one question coming from Martha, and she asks, I'm not sure where in the conversation this came from, but she says this can only make illness worse. Are prisoners appropriately medicated or just left on their own?
Yeah, so I see the question now. Yes, right. So I think what you're saying, yes, like not treating people in a timely manner can only make illnesses worse, and this is true. Some of those examples show that, right, where you had folks who had treatable, had treatable injuries that ended up being much worse because they just didn't treat them. Are prisoners appropriately medicated or just left on their own? I don't know if that refers to the number of medications that folks receive in prison. There are a number of mental health medications that people receive in prison, and there are a number of sort of just non-mental health medications that people receive in prison. I will say what we heard from speaking to, and what the sort of data showed when we when the experts evaluated it, is that medication can be is not timely provided, right? So like they don't just give out, depends on what the medication is. Some medications they will give out to prisoners for like, say a week's worth or a month's or whatever. But others, you have to come and get daily. And so there are lots of problems with that system of getting medication to folks. And as far as the mental health medications go, same problems, right? And mental health medications are, many of them, when they actually work best when they're taken consistently and like very consistently, like not just the dosage, but like the timing, right? So like you're taking the same dosage of the same medication at the same time or times every day, and that is that's not happening in our prisons. Whether or not there are some people who have such severe mental illnesses that it's not just a lack of medication or appropriate medication issue. It's it's just sort of a holistic problem, right? Where they're not getting any sort of services, including medication, in a timely and meaningful way. So yes, I hope that answers your question. But there will be the remedial order that the judge is intending to issue does address not just physical health issues, but also mental health issues.
So there's a couple of comments in here. Kara saying that people are not properly medicated in prison. Jess Lark, who's actually going to be speaking with us in 2 weeks, whose son is currently incarcerated in Arizona, says that even if people are given the proper meds, as long as guards are supplying drugs, the meds will be compromised. And then Kara comments again, there's no support for people on mental health meds. We need counseling with the meds.
Yeah, thank you, Kara. So Kara is an expert in some of these issues. And so I appreciate any time that she weighs in. Let's see, people. Yeah, so the other thing about guards that's kind of interesting, and we had a sort of an experiment. We essentially ran an experiment that we didn't want to have to run, meaning COVID, right? During COVID, jails and prisons, for a while, at least in the beginning, right, were completely shut down to non-staff. And so like attorneys in many places could not do in-person visits. Family members could not do in-person visits, and so on and so forth. And yet there were still illicit and illegal, say, drugs rampant in our jails and prisons, right? And the people who were coming in and out every day are employees of the prison, right? The guards and stuff. And so the problem is, or one of the problems is, like, in response to that, right, the impact of any response generally is going to fall on the prisoners, on those folks, and not on the guards, right? And so, individual guards might get, charged with a crime if they get caught, smuggling or drugs into a prison or a jail. But there's almost always sort of broader sort of solutions, let's just say, that are implemented that fall hardest on the folks inside, which is, again, sort of gets back to the sort of dehumanizing aspect of sort of a system that is predicated on locking people in cages.
We also have another question in the Q&A from Beth. Diane Post said in the chat that bail reform bill was dead. At least that's what I think she said. The speaker hasn't commented on this yet. Can you confirm?
Well, my understanding is that, yeah, I believe it's a Democratic, a bill sponsored by a Democrat. And I don't know if you've seen anything in the news, like the Republicans are basically doing everything they can not to even give, a vote or a hearing to Democratic bills. And so, yes, in that sense, it's probably dead. Although, to be fair, the way that the legislature works, nothing is dead. No bill is like dead until seen a die, that when the legislative session ends. So like there's always sort of, in theory, there's always ways, strikers and stuff they can get stuff in. But you're right, yeah, I mean, that bill is most likely not coming back, I would think. But I
Another comment coming from Jess, COVID proves what we already know, that the guards are the primary source for drugs. The employees that work there, the source for drugs. And Kara says people are overdosing left and right now, but there was a nice compliment here. Jared's passion and commitment to correcting the injustice of our incarceration system is obvious and admirable. We're lucky that people like him are donating their time to correcting the evils of our social system. So,
well, I appreciate that. I do. I got into this work through being a public defender, and I thought I had an idea about how troubling it was going to be and how emotionally draining at times it was going to be, and I was not at all prepared for some of the sort of emotional toll that working on these issues can take. The system is just really awful, and if you care about if you care about wanting to alleviate human suffering generally, right, the system it needs to change, like drastically, top, bottom, completely.
So for those of us who, are just, regular people, not connected necessarily with the ACLU, like what can we do to feel like, we can kind of move this forward?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to suggest Kara put her email in the chat, but she is one of our organizers at the ACLU. We are always looking for there it is. We are always looking for volunteers and people that want to be engaged in these issues. We have a Smart Justice campaign which works on these issues. Besides that, like you can get involved in lots of ways. There are lots of organizations, not just the ACLU, that does work on these issues. But yes, one way to plug in would be to check it out, that website Kara put in the chat, and emailing Kara. She is an organizer, like I said, with the ACLU. But there are, having these conversations is important. Reading books on these issues is important. Because these issues are seeking out good media on these issues. I mentioned a few, right? The Appeal is a really good one. The Marshall Project. If you sign up for the Marshall Project, you'll get a daily email that has links to other reporting. Not all of the the links are to other reporting, so not all of it's Vera. Yeah, is another good one. Prisonpolicy.org does a lot of good sort of high level review of prison issues in the US. If the death penalty is important to you, there's an organization called Death Penalty Alternatives in Arizona. They work specifically on death penalty issues, right? If you can also, I didn't get to the slide with my email. You can also, I'll put it in the chat. You can also email me, and if there's a specific issue that you think is super important or worth your time and effort, yeah, that's right. if it's not the ACLU that's working on that issue, right, that we may know of an organization that does work. There's a ton of grassroots organizations in Phoenix, if you're in the Phoenix area, that works on, Poder in Action works on a lot on policing issues. Mass Liberation works on a number of criminal legal reform issues. And so, there are a number of grassroots organizations that work on these issues, and there's always places to plug in. And the more people that do, the more likely it is that we'll have some more successes in the future. I mean, this is it's like turning around, like the biggest ship you can possibly think about, because it took us decades to get here. And to be fair, it was a bipartisan effort that got us here. And it's probably going to be need to be a bipartisan effort to pull it back. And so, yes, you should reach out to any of these organizations, check out their websites. They all do amazing work and different work, right? And so,
there is one more question from Michelle on the Facebook video, and it says, have there been studies on the true cost of bad prisons, criminal systems in a holistic way, like the effect on society, what harm, violence costs the city, state, consequently from the ways imprisonment happens here?
Yes, do some Googling. You should find some stuff. If you're looking for reports, one thing is a lot of public libraries will have on their website will allow you to access like JSTOR, JSTOR, or other websites that collect like academic research papers, and sometimes you can have, and usually they cost money to sort of be able to access them, but often public libraries will have access to them. And so if you're a member of the public library, you can access these databases. And then, the cool thing about that is that when you search for issues and find articles, right, they're not, they're academic articles, most of them peer reviewed, whatever it is, or you can at least tell you whether they are or not. That one article I talked about early on might actually be something pretty close to what is being asked about. Let me see what that was called. Where is it? Yeah, so it was custodial sanctions and reoffending, a meta-analytic review. If you Google that, you should be able to find that report. If not, and you really want to read it, it's probably going to be pretty dry. You might want to read like the executive summary, but just email me. I can probably find you the link.
Well, I don't see any more questions. Again, another great conversation about such an important issue that I feel like so many of us just go through our day and ignore, the plight of people who are incarcerated. So I really appreciate the work that you do. I appreciate everybody who showed up today. And despite some of this bad news, we've got at least some places where we could put our positive energy and help folks that are doing this good work. And I hope that everybody has a great weekend. Thanks again, Jared.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Have a great weekend, everybody. Bye-bye.